They never planned for this story to survive, not because it was too violent, not because it was too cruel, but because it was too quiet. History remembers what shouts. It forgets what whispers. What remains in the official record of the 18th and 19th centuries is noise, ship manifests, trade volumes, legal decrees, dates carefully aligned to look inevitable. The machinery of slavery is described in numbers and procedures, as if suffering were an administrative side effect. But there are gaps, not missing pages, not damaged archives. Silences, places where the ink stops without explanation, places where the narrative ends, where events are implied but never described, where the historian's voice hesitates, then moves on. Those silences were not accidents. They were constructed. What they never wrote down was not what happened in the open fields, under the sun, where violence could be justified as discipline or economy. What they never wrote down happened indoors, behind walls thick enough to swallow sound, in rooms that were never meant to be described. Walls do not appear in records the way people do. They are treated as background, as neutral, as passive. They were not. In the era of slavery, walls were instruments. They controlled movement, visibility, and time itself. They separated bodies. They redirected sound. They enforced forgetting long before forgetting had a name. Some walls were built to last. Others were built to hide. And some were built to remember. There are estates that appear suddenly in the historical record, fully operational, profitable, architecturally complex, without any trace of how they were constructed. No permits, no labor logs, no correspondence describing their design. They emerged complete, as if they had been waiting. Then, years later, they vanished just as cleanly, renamed, repurposed, burned, absorbed into other properties. Their original layouts erased, their internal divisions removed from memory. No official record explains why. Local accounts are vague, careful, unwilling. People speak of them only in fragments, often lowering their voices without realizing it. Even generations later, the language tightens when these places are mentioned. Not fear, habit. What they never wrote down is how long habits last when they're built into stone. Inside these structures, time behaved differently. Days were not marked by clocks or calendars, but by repetition, by the opening and closing of doors, by enforced stillness, by silence that arrived not naturally but deliberately. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of restraint, and restraint leaves residue. Visitors to these sites, long after the system that created them had ended, described the same sensation, a pressure that had no source, a heaviness that did not belong to the air, a feeling of being observed, not by anyone, but by the space itself. They stayed briefly, then they left. No official record explains why no one stayed longer, because the walls did not encourage it. They were designed to shorten attention, to make presence uncomfortable, to ensure that nothing lingered long enough to be understood. This was not superstition. It was engineering. The architecture of slavery was not only about control of bodies, it was about control of memory. If people could not remain together long enough, if sound could not travel, if time could not be measured, then stories could not form. And without stories, there is nothing to testify. What they never wrote down is that the most effective form of erasure does not destroy evidence. It prevents memory from organizing itself. Walls excel at this. They do not argue. They do not explain. They do not justify. They simply remain. And in remaining, they absorb. They absorb breath. They absorb movement. They absorb the presence of people who were never meant to be remembered as individuals. When slavery officially ended, these walls did not disappear. Laws changed, economies shifted, narratives adjusted, but the walls stayed. And walls that have learned silence do not forget how to hold it. This story is not about what was done. It is about what was contained, about what could not leave the room, about what never reached paper, about what survived only because the walls remembered it. And the walls are still here, not all of them standing, but all of them listening. They built those rooms the way people build graves, quietly, quickly, with the confidence that no one would ever dig. From the outside, The estates looked ordinary: large houses, storage sheds, chapels, mills. The kind of architecture that tells the public story: wealth, order, lineage. But the public story was always a performance. The real structure was behind it, behind the decorated doors, behind the curtains, behind the corridors that did not appear on any plan. What they never wrote down was that certain buildings were designed not to expand life, but to narrow it, to compress people into smaller spaces, shorter interactions, fewer words, to keep groups from forming, to keep recognition from becoming solidarity, because solidarity is louder than chains. In the 18th and 19th centuries, law did not need to prove cruelty. It only needed to preserve property. Everything else, the fear, the discipline, the fragmentation, was managed privately. And private management leaves private architecture. If you want to understand what they erased, do not start with the ships. Start with the floor plans. Or rather, start with the absence of floor plans. There are estates where the main house is described in detail: number of rooms, width of verandas, imported materials, furniture lists. But the attached structures, the ones closest to the main house, the ones that should have required the most labor, are barely mentioned. Sometimes they're called annexes, sometimes service quarters, sometimes storage. Words that mean nothing and everything. No official record explains why these sections were rarely detailed, even in inventories that accounted for every chair and candle, because these spaces were not meant to be counted. They were meant to function, and function depends on silence. Workers who restored surviving ruins in later years noticed recurring features: the same strange narrowing hallways, the same doors placed at odd angles, the same rooms without windows, even where windows would have been practical, the same thick walls that absorbed sound so efficiently that speech felt wasted. They called it poor planning. It wasn't. It was planning that did not care about comfort. The architecture served a single purpose: to make people feel alone even when they were surrounded. What they never wrote down is how carefully that loneliness was maintained, not only through separation by language or origin, but through time, through staggering, through forced schedules that ensured two people rarely shared the same space long enough to speak freely. A door opens, a body moves, a door closes, the rhythm of containment. If you walk those corridors today, those that survive, you can still feel the rhythm, not because ghosts haunt the place, but because repetition leaves traces. Even empty, the space teaches your body how to move through it. It encourages haste. It discourages pause. It makes stillness feel wrong. No official record explains why a room can make you want to leave before you understand what you are seeing. But anyone who has entered such places knows the sensation, the sudden fatigue, the restless urge to shift your weight, check the time, find the exit, even when nothing happens. Especially when nothing happens. Because nothing happening is the point. The rooms were designed to prevent anything from happening that could be carried out of them. They were designed to stop stories at the source. What they never wrote down is how much they feared story. Not the stories told by owners. Those were safe, curated, flattering. The stories they feared were the ones formed in the dark, between people who were supposed to be interchangeable. A name spoken twice, a remembered place, a pattern of survival, shared quietly. These are the beginnings of continuity. Continuity creates memory. Memory creates refusal. So continuity was attacked before it could grow. The walls helped. They didn't just separate bodies. They separated time. Inside those rooms, time became blurred. Without windows, you lose the sun. Without clocks, you lose sequence. Without sequence, memory loses shape. Days become indistinct. Events slip out of order. What happened yesterday feels like it happened years ago, or not at all. That is not a side effect. It is the mechanism. No official record explains why disorientation would be useful when control already existed by force. Because force cannot prevent thought, but confusion can. Confusion breaks narrative. Narrative is how humans hold reality. Break narrative long enough, and people stop expecting coherence. They stop believing that events should make sense. They stop imagining future outcomes. They become present only. Present-only people do not plan. They endure. This was a deeper economy of slavery, an economy of broken timelines, and the walls were its accountants. What they never wrote down is that some enslaved people resisted this not by rebellion, but by creating their own clocks, not mechanical clocks, ritual clocks, rhythms, repeated gestures, marks on stone, so low they would not be noticed, patterns of song that encoded sequence even when language was forbidden, small acts, but repetition is powerful. Repetition can outlast law. That is why owners feared gathering, feared sound, feared anything that created shared rhythm outside their control. The system could tolerate labor. It could tolerate suffering. It could not tolerate a rhythm that belonged to the enslaved, because rhythm becomes a map, and maps lead out, so the walls were built to swallow rhythm. And yet, something survived, not in papers, not in official testimony, in matter, in the way certain walls were reinforced again and again, as if something inside pressed outward, in the way certain rooms were sealed not because they were unsafe, but because they had become too heavy with what they held. There are accounts, rare, private, of owners instructing that particular doors never be open again. No explanation, no list of contents, just a command. Brick it, close it, leave it. No official record explains why a man who owned everything would fear a room he built himself, unless the room had learned something, unless the room had absorbed too much, unless the walls were no longer neutral. Those who knew never spoke again. But the walls did, not with sound, with pressure. And pressure does not vanish when laws change. It remains uninterested in politics or morality, only interested in what happened inside. What they never wrote down is that when abolition came, many owners rushed to erase more than ownership. They rushed to erase architecture. They dismantled sections. They repurposed rooms. They rebuilt entrances, so old corridors no longer led where they once did. They attempted to confuse the future, but confusion is only effective if nothing remains to orient you, and the walls remained. Even altered, they kept the shape of what was missing. A doorway bricked over still leaves its outline. A corridor shortened still leaves its wrongness. A sealed room still presses against the rest of the building like a held breath. If you stand in the right place, you can feel where the building does not match itself. No official record explains why a structure can feel dishonest, but dishonesty is weight, and weight gathers. This is where the story starts to tighten, because the system was not only built on visible cruelty, it was built on invisible design. And invisible design is harder to expose than any chain. Chains can be photographed, walls can be admired, but the way a wall teaches you to leave, that is harder to prove, harder to accuse, harder to erase. And that is why they tried so hard to make sure no one stayed long enough to notice. Because if someone did, if someone stayed, the walls would have to do something they were never meant to do. They would have to reveal what they had been holding all along. The first thing the walls taught was impatience. Not anger, not panic, impatience. A subtle, gnawing urge to move on before anything could settle. A sensation that staying was unnecessary, even wasteful. That whatever mattered could be understood quickly or not at all. This was not accidental. What they never wrote down is that impatience is easier to cultivate than fear. Fear can turn into defiance. Impatience turns into compliance. You leave not because you are forced to, but because you feel finished before you are. Inside those rooms, nothing urged you to stay. The air did not invite conversation. The light did not linger. Sound died quickly, flattened against thick surfaces that refused to carry it. Words felt pointless. And when words feel pointless, people stop trying to use them. No official record explains why certain buildings from the slavery era share the same atmosphere, even across continents. Different climates, different materials, different owners. The same pressure, the same sense that something wants you gone. Historians would call it coincidence. Architects might call it style. Psychologists might call it suggestion. But suggestion requires imagination. This did not. It operated whether you believed in it or not. The walls did not threaten. They did not intimidate. They did not display instruments of violence. They simply shorten your attention span until the idea of staying felt irrational. And once you leave, memory collapses. You remember being there, but not why. You recall the place, but not the sensation. The experience resists language. It slips through description. That is how it survives scrutiny. What they never wrote down is that these spaces were never meant to be interrogated. They were meant to be passed through, like corridors between events, like pauses without significance. But pauses, when repeated, become structure inside the system of slavery. The most dangerous thing was not escape. Escape could be punished. The most dangerous thing was connection that persisted long enough to outlast interruption. So interruption became architectural. Rooms were not built for gatherings. They were built for rotation. People moved in and out in patterns that prevented familiarity. No one stayed long enough to know who else had been there before them. Time was fragmented deliberately. And fragmentation does not end with emancipation. When slavery was legally dismantled, the logic that supported it did not vanish. It retreated into habit, into design, into the inherited understanding of how long a person should remain in a place without purpose. The walls carried that logic forward. What they never wrote down is that after abolition, many of these structures were described as unsettling by those who had no historical reason to feel that way. New owners, visitors, clergy, officials, people with no knowledge of what happened there. They could not explain their discomfort. They did not need to. The walls explained it for them, not with stories, with constraint. You felt watched without a watcher, pressured without a threat, tired without effort. The body reacted before the mind could form an argument. This is how environments train behavior across generations. You do not inherit the story. You inherit the response. And responses feel personal, even when they are not. No official record explains why some people grew agitated in these spaces, while others felt numb. Why some hurried while others froze. Why some refused to enter at all. But the walls were not neutral. They responded differently to different bodies. They always had. Bodies carry history, even when they do not know it. Posture, breath, tempo, the way someone occupies space reveals more than their words ever could. The walls learned this early. They learned how to read bodies, how to apply pressure where it would be most effective, how to amplify discomfort without revealing its source. This was not conscious. It was cumulative. Years of repetition create patterns that no one needs to remember deliberately. That is why these spaces continue to function long after their original purpose ended. They no longer held enslaved people, but they still shaped movement, still shortened conversations, still discouraged lingering. The system had migrated from law to environment. What they never wrote down is that migration is more permanent than policy. Laws can be repealed, buildings remain, and buildings teach. They teach where to stand. They teach how long to stay. They teach when to leave. The walls taught leaving very well. That is why so few accounts exist of what happened inside. Not because nothing happened, because no one stayed long enough to form a narrative that could survive interruption. Those who did stay, those rare exceptions, left no public testimony. Their experiences appear only as fragments in private letters, marginal notes, half-finished sentences. I could not. There was something about the room. I did not remain. These statements go nowhere. They end without conclusion. No official record explains why they were never followed up, because to follow them up would require returning, and return was discouraged by design. The walls ensured that. They did not lock doors. They did not bar exits. They made return feel unnecessary, unwise, unproductive, and so people learned to trust their instinct to move on. Instinct is powerful. It feels internal. But instinct can be trained. The walls trained it. This is a part of the story that unsettles those who want clear villains and clear victims. Because here, cruelty does not appear as spectacle. It appears as environment, as atmosphere, as a design choice that survives its justification. What they never wrote down is that when you remove visible violence, what remains can be more durable, more difficult to confront, more easily denied. Because how do you accuse a room? How do you indict a corridor? How do you prove that a wall remembers something it was never allowed to record? You cannot, not directly. And that is why the system trusted the walls. They were the perfect witnesses. They saw everything. They told nothing until someone stayed. And staying, however briefly, began to change the equation. Because impatience only works when no one resists it. And resistance in this context did not look like rebellion. It looked like stillness. Someone who did not rush. Someone who did not leave when the room suggested it was time. Someone who remained just long enough to notice that the pressure was not random, that it had direction, that it had memory, and that it had been waiting for exactly this kind of attention all along. Stillness was never supposed to happen. The rooms were built to prevent it. Corridors that bent slightly, just enough to disorient. Ceilings low enough to compress breath. Doorways placed where the body hesitated, without knowing why. Every detail encouraged movement, quiet, obedient movement. But occasionally, someone stayed. Not out of courage, out of fatigue, out of confusion. They stopped trying to understand the space, and simply remained inside it. And when that happened, the walls behaved differently. What they never wrote down is that these rooms were reactive, not alive, not conscious. Reactive in the way materials absorb stress over time and release it unevenly. Reactive in the way a sealed container changes pressure when opened too slowly. When someone stayed, the impatience did not disappear. It deepened. The urge to leave sharpened into something physical. A tightening in the chest, a heaviness behind the eyes, the sense that time had begun to thicken, as if minutes were pressing against each other. No official record explains why time would feel distorted in an empty room, but distortion was the point. Inside these spaces, time had never been allowed to flow normally. It had been broken into fragments, short enough to endure, too short to organize. People learned to exist without duration. That training did not vanish when the people did. The walls remembered it. When stillness occurred, the walls attempted to correct it. The environment applied pressure where it always had. Fatigue, distraction, the subtle discomfort that makes thought feel unnecessary. Most people responded instinctively. They left, but when someone did not, something unfamiliar happened. The pressure stopped escalating. It plateaued, as if the room had reached the limit of what it knew how to do. What they never wrote down is that these spaces were never designed to deal with endurance. They were designed to deal with compliance. Endurance was an anomaly, and anomalies reveal systems. Those who remained long enough describe the same sensation. Not terror, not revelation. Something quieter and more disturbing. A sense that the room was holding something back. Not an object, not a presence. A weight. The weight did not move. It did not approach. It did not threaten. It simply existed, distributed unevenly across the space, heavier near certain walls, lighter near others, as if the room had absorbed an imbalance long ago and never released it. People could feel where the imbalance was strongest. They gravitated away from it instinctively. This instinct was older than thought. What they never wrote down is that avoidance patterns formed even without instruction. People positioned themselves unconsciously in the same places. They avoided standing in certain corners. They lingered near thresholds without realizing why. The room guided behavior without command. This was the architecture doing what it had always done. But now, the guidance was being noticed, not consciously. Somatically, the body recognized repetition. And repetition invites memory. Memory did not arrive as images or stories. It arrived as proportion. Too many bodies for too little space. Too much silence for too long. Too many interruptions preventing completion. These proportions were wrong. They could not be rationalized, but they could be felt. What they never wrote down is that the enslaved had felt these proportions daily. Their bodies had learned them intimately. Learned how much air was allowed, how much movement was tolerated, how long presence could last before it was punished. Those lessons were never recorded. They did not need to be. They were embedded. The walls carried them forward. That is why new occupants felt discomfort without knowledge. The body was reading an old equation written into space, one it had never learned consciously, but recognized anyway. This is how the past survives erasure, not as fact, as calibration. The walls calibrated behavior. They taught people how to exist within limits they could not see. And for generations, that teaching went uninterrupted until someone stayed long enough to sense the edges. When that happened, the room did not reveal a secret. It revealed a boundary, the boundary between endurance and erasure, between surviving something and being allowed to remember it. Those who crossed that boundary, briefly, accidentally, did not emerge with answers. They emerged with disturbance that did not resolve. They found themselves thinking about the room later, dreaming of corridors that narrowed, remembering silence that felt intentional. No official record explains why people will be affected by places long after leaving them, but places are not neutral. They carry instructions, and once those instructions are noticed, they cannot be unnoticed. This is where the system began to fail, not because anyone exposed it, but because it was felt by people who had no reason to feel anything at all. The walls had been trusted to erase without trace, but they had only delayed recognition. And recognition, once it begins, does not ask permission. It waits, patiently, like the walls themselves, holding what they were never meant to release, until stillness returns again. And the failure was subtle. It did not look like collapse. It looked like repetition. More people stayed. Not many, not often, but enough for a pattern to begin forming. What they never wrote down is that systems built on interruption only fail when interruption stops being reliable, when impatience no longer guarantees departure, when fatigue no longer ends attention. This is what began to happen in the mid-19th century, quietly, unevenly, without coordination. A clerk assigned to inspect an abandoned structure lingered longer than required. A priest paused mid-prayer, distracted not by fear but by an unfamiliar density in the air. A traveler sheltering from rain waited longer than necessary before leaving. None of them recorded what they felt. They did not have a language, but they noticed the same thing. The pressure was not infinite. It had limits. When someone stayed past a certain point, the room stopped pushing. The urgency dulled. The discomfort stabilized. It did not vanish, but it became bearable. This was not relief. It was exposure. What they never wrote down is that exposure did not reveal events. It revealed absence, the shape of something that had been prevented from happening, conversations that never finished, gestures interrupted too early, shared rhythms cut short before they could solidify. The room held the negative space of those moments. And negative space has weight. People felt it most strongly near certain walls, places where sound died faster, where the air felt thicker, where the body instinctively avoided standing, even without reason. These locations were consistent, not symbolic, functional. They corresponded to where people had been kept longest, where movement had been most restricted, where stillness had been enforced most aggressively. No official record explains how such precision could survive without documentation. But repetition does not need records. It needs structure. The walls had been structured for containment. They remembered where pressure had been greatest. They retained it unevenly, like a material that has been bent too far and never fully straightened. When people remained in those spaces, they felt the bend, not as pain, as imbalance. Something was off. An imbalance invites adjustment. The body shifts its stance. Breath changes. Attention narrows. People become careful without knowing why. This carefulness was new. It disrupted the old rhythm of compliance. Those who felt it did not panic. Panic would have driven them out. Instead, they became quiet, attentive, as if listening for something that was not a sound. What they never wrote down is that listening is dangerous to systems built on silence. Silence works best when no one waits for it to say something. But now, people were waiting. The room did not answer. It did not need to. The waiting itself was enough. Waiting allows fragments to connect, allows the body to sense continuity where it was trained to expect interruption. For enslaved people, continuity had been the greatest threat. Continuity meant memory. Memory meant coordination. Coordination meant refusal. So continuity had been attacked relentlessly. Now, continuity returned, not through rebellion, but through duration. A few extra minutes, a few extra breaths, a pause that did not immediately resolve into movement. These were small acts, but small acts accumulate. What they never wrote down is that accumulation was what the walls had always done best. Now, accumulation was happening in the opposite direction. The pressure held by the walls began to meet pressure held by presence. This did not cancel anything out. It created tension. Tension that did not know where to go. The system had no response for this. It could punish rebellion. It could isolate resistance. But it could not address endurance that asked for nothing. People who experienced this did not speak publicly. Not because they were silenced, but because they sensed that speaking would reduce the experience. Turn it into something manageable. Something dismissible. They did not want that. So the knowledge remained tacit, carried in posture, in hesitation, in the way certain people slowed when entering old buildings without knowing why. No official record explains how behavior can spread without language, but behavior spreads faster than words, especially when the environment reinforces it. The walls reinforced it. They no longer expelled everyone automatically. They tested, they applied pressure, then waited as if recalibrating, as if unsure whether the old commands still worked. Uncertainty entered the system. Uncertainty is corrosive. It weakens authority without challenging it directly. Owners, officials, later caretakers sensed this unease and reacted the only way they knew how. They closed doors. They sealed rooms. They limited access. Not because something had happened, because something might. This reaction is telling. No official record explains why people would fear empty rooms, unless the emptiness was not empty, unless it was holding something that required constant interruption to remain contained. The walls had been trusted for generations to manage that interruption. Now they hesitated. They had encountered something they were never designed to handle. Presence that did not flee. Attention that did not disperse. Duration that refused to collapse into forgetfulness. This is the moment where the meaning of the walls begins to shift. They are no longer just instruments of erasure. They are sites of tension, between what was suppressed and what refuses to remain suppressed, between the past that was meant to dissolve and the present that accidentally stayed long enough to feel it. This tension does not resolve. It deepens, and once it deepens, it changes what the walls are capable of holding. They were built to contain memory. They were not built to share it. And sharing, however quiet, is what has begun. Sharing did not announce itself as transmission. Nothing passed from one person to another in words. There was no story repeated, no explanation exchanged, no warning given. And yet something moved. What they never wrote down is that silence can travel without sound. It travels through posture, through pacing, through the way someone hesitates at a doorway for no clear reason. By the latter half of the 19th century, this hesitation began to appear in places far from the original rooms. Buildings constructed later, by different hands, began to echo the same pressure, not because they copied the design deliberately, but because they reused materials, bricks, beams, stones taken from older structures and placed into new ones. Reuse was practical. Reuse was economical. Reuse was careless. No official record explains why anyone would worry about where a brick came from. But bricks remember weight. They remember compression. They remember heat. They remember being part of a boundary that never opened. When those materials were moved, the pressure did not disappear. It redistributed. It attached itself to new corridors, new walls, new rooms that were never meant to carry it. This is how the condition spread. Not as rumor, not as belief, as atmosphere. People noticed it first in places that should have felt neutral. Municipal buildings, storehouses, schools, rooms where nothing historically significant had happened, at least nothing recorded, yet the same sensations appeared. The same impatience, the same fatigue, the same urge to leave before understanding why you were there. No official record explains how architecture can inherit behavior, But behavior does not belong to people alone. It belongs to space. The walls had taught bodies how to move for generations. That teaching did not end when the walls were dismantled. It followed the materials. It followed the proportions. It followed the habits of construction that prioritize containment over comfort. This is why certain buildings feel oppressive even when empty, not threatening. Oppressive, they ask something of you. They demand movement. They discourage pause. They make stillness feel like a mistake. What they never wrote down is that these sensations were strongest in places built quickly, cheaply, without concern for light or flow. Places designed to process people rather than welcome them. Processing is a descendant of containment, and containment leaves residue. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the original purpose of these spaces was forgotten or intentionally blurred. Slavery became a chapter, a topic, a subject to be discussed at a distance. But the spaces remained active. They continued to shape behavior in ways that felt personal rather than historical. People blamed themselves for their discomfort, for their distraction, for their fatigue. They did not blame the room. That misdirection was essential. What they never wrote down is that the most effective systems ensure that their effects are interpreted as individual weakness. If discomfort feels personal, it will never be traced back to design. The walls relied on this. They relied on the assumption that people would always look inward first, and they were right for a long time. But as more people experienced the same reactions in different places, something subtle changed. The experience stopped feeling unique. Patterns emerged, not clearly, not conclusively, but enough to raise quiet questions. Why does this room feel like that one? Why does silence behave the same way here? Why do I always feel the urge to leave at the same moment? These questions did not lead to answers. They led to awareness. Awareness without language is dangerous. It does not resolve. It does not conclude. It lingers. People carried it with them, unconsciously adjusting how they entered spaces. They slowed slightly. They scanned rooms before settling. They noticed how certain areas seemed to drain attention faster than others. This noticing was new. It disrupted the old training. The walls had taught people not to notice. Now, noticing had begun, not everywhere, not consistently, but enough for the environment to feel less certain of itself. What they never wrote down is that environments, like systems, depend on predictability. They expect bodies to respond in known ways. When those responses change, the environment's influence weakens. The walls began to lose their rhythm. They still applied pressure, still shortened patience, still encouraged exit. But the timing was off. Some people left immediately. Others stayed longer. A few returned. Return was not part of the original design. Return implies unfinished business. The walls had always ensured that nothing felt unfinished, only abandoned. Now abandonment was no longer guaranteed. Those who returned did not seek answers. They sought familiarity, a way to understand the pressure by experiencing it again. This was unprecedented. The walls were accustomed to single encounters, not repetition. Repetition allowed comparison. Comparison revealed that the pressure was not random. It had structure. It had thresholds. It had limits. Limits invite testing. And testing, however quiet, is a form of resistance. The system did not recognize it as such. It had no language for it, but the walls felt it. They responded by intensifying fatigue in some areas and loosening it in others. They behaved inconsistently, as if recalibrating a mechanism that had never needed recalibration before. This inconsistency mattered, because inconsistency breaks trust. Once people stop trusting their instinct to leave, they begin to question why that instinct existed in the first place. That question does not lead immediately to history. It leads to presence, to staying just a little longer, to breathing through discomfort, to noticing how silence changes when you do not rush it. These acts are small, but the system was built to prevent small acts from accumulating. Now, accumulation had resumed, not of rebellion, not of narrative, of duration. And duration, once reclaimed, does not disappear easily. The walls had lost something essential. They could still remember, but they could no longer guarantee forgetting. Forgetting had never been passive. It had required effort. The walls had done that work quietly for decades, then for generations, absorbing attention, draining it, returning people to a world lighter, emptier, convinced that nothing worth holding had occurred. Now that mechanism hesitated. What they never wrote down is that hesitation is contagious. Once a space fails to complete its task, once it allows someone to leave carrying weight instead of shedding it, that failure alters expectations. The next person enters differently, slower, more alert, less willing to surrender attention immediately. The walls noticed this change. Not consciously, structurally, pressure began to arrive in waves instead of a single force. It surged and paused and surged again. Fatigue no longer felt inevitable. It could be resisted, not heroically, but quietly, by remaining still long enough for the sensation to level out. This leveling was crucial because once pressure stabilizes, it can be examined, not analyzed, felt. Those who stayed to the leveling described the same thing. The space stopped asking them to leave. It did not become welcoming. It became neutral. Neutrality was dangerous. The walls had never been neutral. Neutrality allowed people to notice what had been shaping them all along. They noticed how their urge to leave had arrived predictably, how it peaked at certain durations, how it faded if ignored. This predictability exposed the mechanism. No official record explains how exposure, without explanation, can dismantle control. But control depends on mystery. Once the pattern is felt, mystery weakens. People began to test this without meaning to. They lingered slightly longer in one place, slightly less in another. They paid attention to how different rooms produced different intensities of pressure. They were mapping, not the building, the effect. Mapping did not require drawings or notes. It happened in the body, a sense of where it was hardest to remain, where breath shortened, where the air seemed heavier. These places were consistent, not symbolic, operational. They marked where the system had worked hardest. What they never wrote down is that places of greatest control also carry the greatest residue. Pressure accumulates where resistance once mattered most, where time was most aggressively broken. When people remained there now, they felt the concentration, not as pain, as density. The density did not repel them. It anchored them. Anchoring was new. The walls had always been built to prevent anchoring, to keep people moving, rotating, replacing one body with another before familiarity could form. Now familiarity formed with the space itself. This was not intimacy. It was recognition. Recognition does not need warmth to function. It needs repetition. People returned, not to reclaim anything, not to uncover secrets, but to experience the pressure again, to see if it behaved the same way twice. It did. That sameness mattered, because sameness allowed trust. Not trust in the walls, trust in perception. Once people trusted what they felt, they stopped blaming themselves. Fatigue was no longer a failure. Discomfort was no longer weakness. It was a response, and responses can be chosen. This choice was subtle. It did not look like decision. It looked like pacing, staying a few seconds longer, leaving a few seconds earlier, returning once more. Each choice weakened the wall's authority slightly. Authority does not collapse at once. It erodes. The walls attempted to compensate. They sharpened pressure in some areas, softened it in others. They became inconsistent. Inconsistency bred curiosity. Curiosity does not shout. It lingers. People began to ask questions internally, questions without answers, but with direction. Why here? Why now? Why does this feel familiar? These questions did not lead to history textbooks or archives. They led back into the body, into memory that had never been taught, only trained. The walls had trained generations to move on. Now, some did not, and when they did not, the walls were forced into a role they had never been designed to play. They became participants, no longer just containers of pressure, but responders to presence. This response was imperfect, uneven, unreliable, but it was enough. Enough to ensure that forgetting could no longer complete itself cleanly. Enough to ensure that what had been suppressed would remain unfinished, not exposed, not explained, but present. The walls still held memory, but they no longer held alone. And once memory is shared, even silently, it stops behaving like something that can be sealed away. It begins to wait, not for discovery, for duration, for someone willing to remain just long enough for the pressure to become legible, just long enough for the walls to realize they are no longer in control of how the story continued. Duration changed the terms. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. What they never wrote down is that once a space loses control over how long someone stays, it begins to lose control over what that person carries away. The walls had always relied on speed, on the certainty that presence would be brief, that attention would be cut short before it could gather weight. Now, attention lingered, and when attention lingers, it begins to compare. People noticed that the pressure they felt in one place echoed the pressure in another, that certain rooms, built in different years on different lands, produced the same impatience, the same fatigue, the same narrowing of thought. These similarities were too precise to dismiss. Not identical, consistent. Consistency implies design. What they never wrote down is that design does not end with construction. It continues through use, through repetition, through the way bodies are trained to respond long after the original purpose has been forgotten. The walls had trained response. Now, response was being observed. Observation is destabilizing. When someone feels pressure without immediately obeying it, they begin to sense its limits. They learn how long it takes to rise, how long it lasts, where it concentrates, where it thins. This learning does not feel intellectual. It feels practical. People adjusted how they stood, how they breathed, how they oriented themselves within the room. They discovered that certain positions intensified the heaviness, while others softened it. This was not chance. The pressure had direction, and direction implies intent. No official record explains how a building can appear to guide behavior decades after its purpose is ended. But guidance does not require intention. It requires structure. The walls had structure. They had been built to manage bodies, not minds. To interrupt gathering, not to explain why. To fragment time, not to measure it. Those priorities remained embedded. When people stayed long enough now, they felt those priorities pressing against them, not as orders, but as resistance. The room resisted certain behaviors. It discouraged stillness. It pushed against prolonged attention. When that resistance failed, it shifted. The walls adapted. This adaptation was uneven. Some rooms lost their force more quickly. Others intensified. It depended on how much pressure they had once held. What they never wrote down is that the places of greatest containment leave the deepest imprint, where bodies have been most compressed, where time had been most aggressively fragmented. The walls retained the strongest residue. People sensed this instinctively. They avoided those areas at first. Then they returned, not to confront anything, not to uncover anything, to understand the pressure by feeling it again. Return creates familiarity. Familiarity weakens fear. Without fear, pressure loses its leverage. The walls responded by increasing fatigue, a familiar tactic. Exhaustion had always been effective. It made endurance feel pointless. But endurance had already occurred. And once someone has endured something once, they know it can be endured again. This knowledge is dangerous. It does not require bravery, only memory. What they never wrote down is that memory does not always come as recall. It can come as confidence. The quiet certainty that a sensation has an end, that it does not escalate forever, that it can be waited out. Waiting out pressure reveals something essential. It reveals that the pressure is not natural. It is applied. Applied things can be resisted, not with force, but with time. The walls were built to outlast time. They were not built to be tested by it. Now, time worked differently inside these spaces. Minutes no longer collapsed into impatience automatically. They stretched. They thickened. They became measurable again. This return of duration allowed fragments to align, not fragments of events, fragments of feeling, the sense of being interrupted repeatedly, the sensation of never finishing a thought, the exhaustion of constant readiness to move. These sensations matched. They formed a pattern. What they never wrote down is that pattern recognition is how systems are exposed without being named. Once someone senses a pattern, they carry it with them. They recognize it elsewhere. They anticipate it. They prepare for it. Preparation changes outcome. The walls began to encounter prepared bodies. Bodies that did not flinch immediately. Bodies that did not rush to comply. Bodies that remained just long enough to feel the mechanism working. This was not confrontation. It was coexistence. And coexistence altered the wall's role. They could no longer erase memory efficiently. They could only hold it. Holding is different from containing. Containing seals. Holding supports. The walls were becoming supports without being asked. This transformation was slow, unintended, irreversible. What they never wrote down is that systems fail not when they are attacked, but when they are repurposed quietly by those who remain inside them. The walls had been repurposed, not into monuments, not into lessons, into spaces where forgetting no longer completed itself. This did not free the past. It made it persistent, persistent enough to be felt again, persistent enough to resist final erasure. And persistence is patient, more patient than any wall, waiting for the next moment of stillness, for the next person who does not rush, for the next failure of forgetting to finish its work. Persistence does not demand attention. It waits for it. What they never wrote down is that once forgetting fails to complete itself, it does not reverse. It stalls. It lingers at the edges of awareness, neither gone nor fully present. This liminal state was never planned for. The walls have been designed for absolutes. Contain or release. Erase or suppress. Silence or movement. They were not built for suspension. Now, suspension spread. People began to leave these spaces carrying something unfinished. Not knowledge, not images. A residue, like the feeling of a sentence cut off mid-thought. The kind that returns later, uninvited, when nothing else explains it. This residue attached itself to other rooms, offices, archives, places where paperwork moved faster than people. The same impatience appeared, the same fatigue, the same urge to conclude before understanding. No official record explains why modern buildings could reproduce sensations rooted in centuries-old spaces. But systems replicate themselves. They copy logic, not memory. The logic was simple: shorten attention, fragment time, prevent continuity. The walls had perfected this logic long ago. It survived them. When people encountered it elsewhere, they recognized it, not as history, but as pressure, a familiar resistance to staying with discomfort, a learned reflex to move on. But now, some recognize the reflex itself. Recognition changed behavior. Instead of leaving, they paused. Instead of concluding, they delayed. Instead of accepting fatigue as instruction, they treated it as information. The shift was small, but it accumulated. Accumulation was once the wall's domain, now belonged to presence. What they never wrote down is that presence accumulates silently. It does not announce itself. It does not form groups. It does not require agreement. It only requires repetition, repeated pauses, repeated hesitations, repeated moments where someone chooses not to rush. These repetitions alter the environment, not by changing structure, by changing expectation. Spaces that once assumed brief occupancy now encountered bodies that stayed unpredictably. The old rhythms faltered. Pressure arrived, but did not always succeed. Fatigue pressed, but did not always disperse. The walls had lost their timing. Timing is essential to control. Without it, pressure becomes noise, and noise can be ignored. People learned this. They learned that the discomfort had a peak, that it did not escalate indefinitely, that waiting through it revealed something else beneath. Not relief, clarity, a clarity that did not explain the past, but exposed the mechanism that had shaped the present. The realization was quiet. This place wants me to leave. This system wants me to conclude. This silence wants to remain uninterrogated. Once realized, these wants to be refused. Not angrily, casually. Casual refusal is devastating. It denies the system the drama it expects. What they never wrote down is that systems build on containment fear indifference more than rebellion. Rebellion confirms their power. Indifference renders it optional. The walls had become optional. They still exerted influence, still applied pressure, still shaped behavior, but not decisively. People returned. Return was the clearest sign, not to reclaim anything, not to confront anyone, to verify. Verification requires memory. Memory had returned, not as narrative, but as bodily certainty, the certainty that something unfinished persisted, the certainty that leaving quickly was a learned behavior, not an instinct. Instinct had been trained. Now training was being undone. Slowly, quietly, without permission. The walls could not prevent this. They could only respond, and their responses grew inconsistent. Some spaces softened entirely, others intensified sharply, as if overcompensating. The unevenness revealed the distribution of old pressure, where it had been greatest, where it had been thinner. This map was never written. It was felt. Feeling does not disappear when denied. It waits, and waiting had become the dominant force. The past was no longer sealed behind architecture. It was circulating as sensation, as hesitation, as delay, as a sense that something important should not be rushed. This sense spread without explanation. People carried it into meetings, into conversations, into decisions. They lingered longer than expected. They asked one more question. They refused a clean ending. These acts were not historical. They were present, but the present had been shaped by what the walls once did best, interrupting continuity. Now continuity returned, not as story, as duration. And duration is difficult to control once it is chosen rather than imposed. The walls still stood, but they no longer dictated the tempo. They waited, and waiting, once shared, changes who holds power over what comes next. Because what waits is no longer contained. It is simply there, unfinished, and unwilling to disappear again. Unfinished things behave differently. They do not decay the way closed stories do. They do not fade cleanly. They persist at the edges, resisting summary. What they never wrote down is that once a system loses the ability to finish its own work, once erasure no longer completes itself, it enters a state of quiet instability. Everything still functions. Doors open, rooms empty, people leave, but something remains unresolved. The walls felt this first, not as awareness, as imbalance. They had been built to absorb pressure and return emptiness. Now, pressure lingered without dispersing. It pulled, it accumulated, it pressed unevenly against the structure itself. This changed how the spaces aged. Cracks appeared where they should not have. Paint peeled in irregular patterns. Sound behaved inconsistently. Certain rooms felt heavier at dusk than at dawn, without explanation. Caretakers noticed. They did not document it. No official record explains why people avoid writing down things they cannot rationalize. They call it maintenance. They call it decay. They call it nothing at all. But the walls were not decaying. They were holding something that had never been allowed to settle. What they never wrote down is that memory, when prevented from becoming narrative, becomes pressure. Pressure seeks release. If release is denied, it reshapes its container. The walls had denied release for generations. Now they were reshaping themselves. People who entered these spaces began to feel something new. Not urgency, not fatigue, but gravity. A sense that leaving quickly would be inappropriate, not forbidden. Inappropriate. This distinction mattered. Forbidden invites challenge. Inappropriate invites reflection. Reflection slows movement. Slowness altered behavior in subtle ways. People stood longer at thresholds. They hesitated before closing doors. They looked back without knowing why. Looking back was dangerous. The walls had always depended on forward motion. Backward attention disrupted the sequence. What they never wrote down is that sequence was the true mechanism of control. Not violence, not fear, but order. The predictable order of enter, endure briefly, leave, forget. Now the order fractured. Some people entered and stayed. Some entered, left, then returned. Some entered, left, and carried something with them that changed how they moved elsewhere. This variability weakened the system. The walls responded by intensifying familiar sensations. Fatigue returned more sharply. Discomfort arrived sooner. Silence pressed harder. But the response was no longer effective. Those sensations had become recognizable. Recognition stripped them of authority. People did not fight the pressure. They acknowledged it. Acknowledgement without obedience changed everything. The walls could still apply force. They could no longer guarantee outcome. What they never wrote down is that outcome is the only thing power requires. Influence without outcome is noise. The walls had become noisy, not audibly, existentially. Their signals no longer aligned with behavior. People felt tired and stayed, felt restless and paused, felt urged to leave and waited. Waiting transformed pressure into information. Information changes posture. Posture changes experience. Experience reshapes memory. This loop had reactivated. The loop the system had spent centuries trying to break. Memory no longer arrived as story. It arrived as orientation. A sense of how much space is too little. How much time is not enough. How silence can be used as restraint. These realizations did not remain confined to historical sites. They followed people into offices where meetings ended too quickly, into institutions where processes replaced understanding, into conversations where conclusions arrived before questions were finished. The same pattern, the same impatience, now recognized. What they never wrote down is that once a pattern is recognized, it cannot be unseen. Even if ignored, it persists. Even if denied, it shapes decisions. People began to resist closure, not dramatically, politely. They asked for more time. They delayed conclusions. They sat with discomfort instead of resolving it immediately. These behaviors were not political, not moral. They were spatial. They came from learning how long something could be endured without collapse. The walls had taught endurance through suffering. Now endurance was being practiced through attention. Attention is harder to manage. It does not respond predictably. It does not escalate cleanly. It does not vanish on command. The walls adjusted again. They always adjusted. But adjustment now revealed limitation. They could no longer contain what was being carried forward. The past had escaped architecture, not as story, as pressure redistributed through the present. This redistribution did not demand acknowledgement. It demanded duration. And duration, once reclaimed, changes what forgetting is allowed to do. Forgetting no longer erased. It paused. And pause is not absence. It is potential. The walls senses potential. They had no mechanism for it. They had been built to end things. Now things did not end. They waited. And waiting, when shared by both space and presence, produces a condition that history cannot easily absorb. A condition where the past does not explain itself, but does not let go either. This is where the story begins to lose its shape. Because refusal does not look like opposition. It looks like delay. What they never wrote down is that once delay becomes habitual, systems built on closure begin to fracture from within, not visibly, not catastrophically, but in ways that cannot be corrected without admitting what was never meant to be acknowledged. The walls had always depended on endings. A room emptied, a door closed, a moment concluded. Endings allowed forgetting to complete its work. Now endings stalled. People lingered at the edge of departure. They left rooms slowly. They hesitated before stepping outside. They felt, without language, that something would be lost if they moved too quickly. This feeling did not come from sentiment. It came from proportion. The body sensed imbalance. That too much had been compressed here for too long. That leaving without weight would repeat the original erasure. No official record explains why a person would feel responsible for something they never experienced directly. But responsibility does not always arise from guilt. Sometimes it arises from proximity. The walls had made proximity unavoidable, even altered, even repurposed, even partially destroyed. They maintained a relationship with anyone who entered, a relationship defined not by memory, but by pressure that did not belong to the present moment alone. People began to feel that the space was asking something of them. Not confession, not understanding, duration. Stay long enough. Do not rush. do not conclude. These were not instructions spoken aloud. They were sensed. What they never wrote down is that sensing creates obligation more effectively than rules ever could. Rules can be broken. Sensations must be endured. The walls had taught endurance through coercion. Now endurance was chosen. This choice changed its meaning. Chosen endurance does not seek reward. It does not demand resolution. It accepts incompletion. Incompletion had always been the enemy. The system of slavery required conclusions, ownership, control, finality. Even abolition was framed as an ending, a clean break that allowed history to move on. But the walls did not move on. They remained filled with what had never been allowed to resolve. And now, presence mirrored that refusal. People stopped expecting closure. They stopped asking what the room meant. They stopped trying to interpret sensations into lessons. They stayed with the discomfort as it was. This was unsettling, because discomfort without explanation does not reassure. It destabilizes. The walls responded by intensifying silence, not absence of sound, absence of direction. Silence no longer told people what to do. It waited. Waiting was new. The walls had always dictated tempo. Now tempo was shared. This sharing did not feel cooperative. It felt suspended. A suspension where neither side asserted control. Suspension is fragile, but fragility can last a long time when nothing forces it to resolve. What they never wrote down is that fragility was what the enslaved had been denied. Their lives had been forced into rigid outcomes. Their time had been managed until no suspension was possible. Now suspension returned, not to redeem anything, not to explain anything, to hold what had been compressed. This holding did not heal. Healing would imply repair. Nothing was repaired. The past remained intact in its damage, but it was no longer alone. That is a shift. The walls were no longer the sole bearers of what they contained. Presence shared the weight. Shared weight behaves differently. It does not disappear. It does not crush. It persists. Persisting without resolution alters how history functions. History becomes less about events and more about conditions that continue to shape behavior. The walls had always been conditions. Now that truth was unavoidable. People carried the condition with them when they left. They noticed impatience elsewhere. They recognized how quickly systems pushed toward conclusion. They sensed when silence was being used to hurry them along. They resisted without resistance, by staying with questions, by delaying answers, by allowing uncertainty to remain. These acts were small, but they accumulated. Accumulation had once belonged to the walls alone. Now accumulation belonged to presence as well. The balance had shifted. Not enough to break anything, enough to prevent forgetting from finishing. The walls felt this unfinished state. They did not resist it. They adapted, but adaptation now required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, once it exists, cannot be erased. The walls remain. They still hold memory. But memory no longer rests solely inside them. It has entered duration. And duration, once chosen, is difficult to reclaim by force. This is the quiet point of no return. No revelation. No confession. Just the realization that something has changed. That leaving quickly is no longer neutral. That staying, even briefly, has consequence. The walls are still here. So is the pressure. So is the refusal to conclude. And that refusal does not belong to the past alone anymore. It belongs to the present, waiting, unresolved, and unwilling to be finished. What remains does not announce itself. It settles. What they never wrote down is that once a system fails to complete its erasure, it does not retreat. It adapts into permanence, not as memory you can recall, but as a condition you live inside without noticing. Until you do, by the time this happens, the walls no longer need to press. They have already taught the lesson. People enter these spaces now and feel nothing dramatic. No fear, no shock, just a faint resistance to movement. A hesitation that cannot be justified. A sense that leaving too quickly will be a mistake. Even if nothing is happening. Especially if nothing is happening. This is how the walls finish their work. Not by forcing remembrance. By preventing forgetting from ever feeling complete. No official record explains why some places feel unfinished long after their original purpose has vanished, why certain rooms seem to withhold closure, why silence in some buildings feels heavier than sound. But the explanation was never meant to survive. The system relied on this. If something cannot be explained, it can be ignored. If it can be ignored, it can persist. The walls learned this early. They learned that you do not need to erase everything. You only need to erase enough that what remains cannot organize itself into accusation. You leave fragments, sensations, interruptions, and you trust that people will blame themselves for discomfort. For a long time they did, but now something subtle has shifted. People no longer rush to resolve what they feel. They no longer assume discomfort means error. They stay with it, not heroically, casually, as if waiting for something they do not expect to arrive. This waiting is new, waiting without demand, waiting without purpose. The walls do not know how to respond to this. They were built to manage bodies, not patience. When patience enters a space designed for interruption, the space begins to lose its certainty. It no longer knows whether its pressure will succeed, whether fatigue will disperse attention, whether silence will end the moment. This uncertainty does not break the walls. It unsettles them, and unsettled systems behave differently. They hesitate, they soften, they hold instead of expelling. Holding was never meant to happen. The walls were built to contain, not to share, but sharing has occurred anyway. The pressure they once absorbed alone is now distributed, carried by those who stayed long enough to feel it, passed on without explanation, without instruction, not as story, as presence. People carried into other rooms, other buildings, other institutions. They recognize when time is being shortened deliberately, when silence is being used to hurry them toward conclusion, when impatience is being mistaken for efficiency. They pause, just long enough. That pause is enough, because the system was built on speed, on the certainty that no one would stay with discomfort long enough for it to become legible. Now, legibility has begun, not of events, not of names, not of crimes that could be listed and archived. Legibility of structure, of how erasure was engineered, of how forgetting was maintained, of how the past was kept from finishing its sentence. The walls were part of that engineering. They are still part of it. They still stand. They still hold. They still remember. But they are no longer alone with what they remember. That is the only change. And it is enough, because memory that is shared, even silently, cannot be sealed again. It does not need to be spoken. It does not need to be proven. It only needs to be carried, quietly, patiently, without resolution. The walls remain. So does what they contain. And now, so do you, whether you intended to stay or not. Because once you have felt the hesitation, once you have sensed that leaving quickly would repeat something old, you've already entered the condition they tried so hard to erase. What they never wrote down is that the most dangerous stories are not the ones that accuse. They are the ones that refuse to end. And this one is still here, not asking to be remembered, only making sure that forgetting never quite succeeds again.